Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Scribe's Journey with the Three Scribes. I am Travis J. Crokin, the Calm Scribe, joined here with my two fellow scribes.
I am LJ Stanton, the pedantic scribe.
And I am TR Albee, the oddball scribe.
And you're joining us as we're getting ready to record Season 1, Episode 2 of the Scribe's Journey, covering the topic of the hero's journey. So before we jump into everything, how is everyone doing tonight? How are my fellow scribes doing this evening?
Excellent. Excellent. Got, cats near me, got dogs near me, got, just a nice little cocoon of everything that's awesome.
It sounds like a very fluffy, very cuddly cocoon. I mean,
it is. It's one that I'm not really excited to leave. So if you're looking at that hero's journey, I would be denying that call to adventure.
Yes, you would definitely be refusing the call, even.
Yes, indeed.
And then forced into the adventure regardless. But would you bring your furry friends with you?
Yes. Maybe not the cat, though.
No?
He's too much trouble.
Oh, but then that might be fun.
A cat?
I'm doing good. I have less furry things around me. We're actually down to one furry object, animal in our house. Unfortunately, at one point in time we had 4 or 5. But but she's downstairs sleeping, and my son's asleep. So I'm having my time with you guys, which is good. So it's a good thing. So
that's great. I'm doing fantastic as well. I'm just sitting here. I don't have anything cuddly or fuzzy or anything around me. All I've got is a glass of Woodford Reserve straight Kentucky bourbon, strong enough to make your eyes water. That's about the only thing keeping me warm during this podcast as I sit directly beside my AC vent in my house.
Yeah.
I was actually wrong. I have a baby Yoda, a Groku, right here. He's cuddly, but he's less responsive than cats. I think that's probably
a little bit
closest cuddly that I got.
Well, we are here to talk about the hero's journey tonight, and so for those of you who are just joining us for the first time this episode, or for those of you that were also with us for the last episode, the book of the month last episode was by Joseph Campbell, and it was The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And that was to give you a background for what our topic of discussion is tonight. We will be touching upon the monomyth and Joseph Campbell and The Hero with a Thousand Faces. However, we're going to be talking about what was derived from that, and that is the hero's journey. And we may even touch upon some other journeys throughout as we go along for the chat. But the hero's journey is a very well-known story outlining tool that people use, and just a method of making a story flow really well, keeping it interesting, and there's no end of examples to find for the hero's journey.
Absolutely. Though probably the two most famous ones are going to be Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, because you cannot get away from the hero's journey if you look at either of those.
Yeah, that's very true. It's. I mean, we were trying to figure out what was going to be the book of the month this month, and we're not going to give that away yet. But we were going through different suggestions, and I was pulling random things out of this shelf behind me, and trying to figure out would this fit, and yes, that fit, and I think you mentioned, what was it, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that the original that story. I mean, that's not the book of the month, by the way. It's just that itself follows a hero's journey, and refusal of the call, and then being forced in because his house is no longer there, and then the earth is going to be destroyed. So I mean, I don't know. Sorry. Again.
That's true. It goes in, and one that I've used on stream before and absolutely love, probably was because the other ones are, except for the Hitchhikers, the other ones are really well known. The one I like to refer to often is from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the very first Captain America film. Just because it is a quintessential hero's journey, except that we don't have a refusal of the call. We have a hero that is what we call a willing hero. They see the upset in their world, they want to do something about it, but they're too small and scrawny to join the military to make a difference until I don't want to get too far ahead of myself in the hero's journey here. But the Captain America is kind of a new spin, or not a new spin, but a different take on the hero's journey.
Yeah. Well, for those who maybe are less familiar with the hero's journey, it is the most currently available to everyone, most easily digestible, is a 12-step hero's journey. It's not as new age or addiction as that sounds, saying that there's a 12-step journey for your hero. But it starts out with the ordinary world, the call to adventure, refusal of the call, meeting the mentor, crossing the threshold, tests enemies and allies, approaching the inmost cave, the ordeal, reward, seizing the sword, the road back, resurrection, and return with the elixir. So those are various steps on that journey. And as soon as you know what those steps are, it's so much easier to plot out your own story and also recognize those steps in different stories as well. And then also know which ones you are able to skip or tweak a little bit and play around with. Like with Travis's example with Captain America, there is no refusal of the call. There is too much enthusiasm almost for that call.
That's exactly it. And that's something that, like LG just said, as you know, when you know what they are and how they function, you can learn which ones you can tweak and which ones you can change. And to that end, from the monomyth, which is this kind of the father to this, as Ted pointed out earlier, there is actually several steps that have been taken out of the monomyth for this. So at the end of the recording of the podcast, we are going to be staying around live on and talking about the 5 steps after, or the 5 steps that were taken out and possibly why they were taken out.
Exactly.
Yep. So the first step that we know of is the ordinary world. So the ordinary world is arguably, or not arguably, it is the most important step of your story, because this is where you're introducing the reader to your character and you're getting them hooked. So you need to, in one step, in one story beat, make the reader care about your character, understand who they are, where they are in their ordinary world, what their normal everyday life looks like, and why they're happy and content to be there, or maybe not, and offer something that displeases them about their world, but not enough to make them act on it. So you have to create a 3D character that people can relate to and connect with and actually care about what happens to them as they go along within the first step in the ordinary world.
You know, it's interesting. The other night I was doing my Tuesday night stream, and someone came into our channel, and she's like, this young lady came into my channel and was like, I don't know where to start with this. I wrote this, the call to adventure, which is the next step, doesn't happen till later. What should I should I do? And I kind of said exactly that to her. I was like, well, look, you need to go, and if you're using the hero's journey, the first general thing, like you kind of just described, is showing the world they're in, right? Showing their current setup, why they're happy. I mean, the Hobbit is a perfect example. You know, Bilbo is contempt in his house. He is there smoking his pipe, and lo and behold, Gandalf comes along and just shreds that all up and brings a bunch of dwarves to his house, and then he goes off to adventure, right? And she was like, oh yeah, that's right, I could totally do that. You know, and sometimes people forget that first, not forget, but to your point, I think we were talking about last week as well. There are different plot structures, and sometimes people don't realize that this is the most simple one to follow, and they might already be following it. It's just she didn't think about, okay, maybe I need to introduce my character that way. So showing the world before it gets turned upside down. So.
And that's the thing, is you have to give your hero or heroes, if you have multiple protagonists, you have to give a reason for why they care and why you should care. Because if you didn't, love Hobbiton in The Hobbit, if you didn't love Bag End, if you didn't really get that feeling of coziness, you wouldn't care about the concept of, say, Smaug deciding maybe that he's going to leave his mountain and destroy everything. Or, further into the Lord of the Rings, you wouldn't feel anything about the rest of Middle Earth or Sauron, or when Saruman shows up and sacks Hobbiton, you wouldn't feel anything about those if you didn't get that establishing moment of this is a good place with generally good people that don't deserve terrible things to happen to them. Because if you really introduce a place that's like, this place sucks, and if anything bad that happens to these people, you're going to feel real good about it. That's a little bit of Schadenfreude, and it is perhaps not your hero's journey, or perhaps not the place to start your hero's journey. It might be time to step a little bit further back in that story to maybe before the place turned terrible, and tell that story and then tell the next story.
Prequel.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That was good.
And that's the good point of it, because the other thing that you need to do with the ordinary world is you're setting up, like I said, there's a small problem that is displeasing our hero or soon-to-be hero within their world. But you also need to remember that the hero needs to be in a polar opposite position as they are from the end of the story. So they're not going to start off brave and brash and bold. They're going to start off perhaps timid or just tired and not wanting to go out and do anything. And then in the end, they've got the strength, the courage, the bug of adventure has bitten them, and they're ready to move on. So there's a bit of a mirroring that happens from the beginning to as you'll see at the end. And throughout the story, there's the 12 steps of the hero's journey, but there's also the subplot to remember. And the big part of the subplot is how is each beat along the path changing and altering the character? What lessons are they learning? And where are they faltering backwards to their old ways? And where are they showing growth and moving forward into the new ways?
Exactly.
So
and there's... After you.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to talk about the fact that part of getting that growth is that there's usually some mentor or guardian or someone else who's there that helps bring that potentially reluctant hero to the fore. So you have in Star Wars, you have Obi-Wan. In Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, you have Gandalf. You have this mentor character who shows up and is able to help them with whatever this problem is. And that character is one that is so important, not just to the process of the story, but is a character that you need to make sure is both lovable to the reader in some way, if they're, because people do love like the old crotchety mentor or the more affable mentor. But either way, you need to have a mentor that you feel their loss. Because whether or not they survive the whole story doesn't matter. But the character, your hero, does end up needing to lose them so that they can have the training wheels taken off.
And that is part of their darkest night, which will come up to as we come along. But in order for this to happen, and generally this in the beat 2 is when we kind of do meet the mentor. Oftentimes this is where they make their first appearance, like we were just talking about with Gandalf in Hobbit. But that's usually because the mentor is generally, unless it's an external event like a tornado or a hurricane or something else, or like an attack on a village, there needs to be a call to adventure. There needs to be something that grabs the hero by the coat and says, this thing that's displeasing you is going to get much, much worse. You need to come along and you need to do something to change this.
Or, I mean, you like you guys mentioned before, sometimes you just got to switch it up. I mean, if you look at the like Willow, like I know it was originally, I don't think it was a book. I think Lucas wrote it originally as a movie, and then I think Chris Claremont, I had the extra sequel down there, Shadow Moon, and George Lucas wrote the sequels to it. I'm very excited for the actual Disney Plus Willow series they're bringing out, by the way. This doesn't follow any of the extra lore, but the warrior, who I can't remember his name, who comes up and stirs up the trouble and drags Willow off on this adventure, he doesn't actually die yet, right? He shows him how to survive in a world that he's kind of been avoiding, right? And they also have the small child, which is again, akin to that ring that they have to bring and save that, Tolkien tried to go do with, did with in Lord of the Rings, right? So, but that twist, that changing of that mentor, right, in certain cases like this with the movie Willow, is one of those I guess that changes that happens, that will make the story a little bit more interesting, which is good.
It's that important rule breaking of the, sometimes what the expectation is, and you get to either subvert it or just break it to help further your story. But that is, again, knowing where the rules are, what the rules are, so that you can break them or subvert them in the most effective way possible, so that you still get that refusal and then the growth and that mentor figure coming or going or always being there, but just knowing when to take a step back to let the hero take a step up.
And you know what? I realized that I'm absolutely wrong as I'm saying this, because there was that lady that turned into a bird who was kind of ushering him forward. I am completely up, and I think she died. So I am completely wrong. So never mind.
To be fair,
I've never seen the movie, so I don't know.
No. Oh my God.
I don't think I've ever seen it.
To be fair, though.
Okay, so I know what my homework is after.
Watch Willow.
Right.
But
the book of the month. Watch Willow.
You're absolutely right, though, Ted, is that the mentor doesn't need to die. The mentor, there's a variety of things. The mentor can also turn to be a traitor in the end. The mentor can stay and just lose faith in the hero. Or they can continue on their happy little way. But there are some things that we're going to come across where the hero has, basically what it comes down to is the hero needs to suffer. So when they have the call to adventure, it's like we discussed, there's something that happens and they say, no, you need to go and stop this, great tragedy from happening. And the heroes decided that they're done heroing, they're too old, they don't have any interest, they don't want to go along for anything like that adventurous. And then that's where we have the refusal of the call, where whatever the event is, I'm sure it'll take care of itself. But as a writer, you need to make sure that you do not have something that can be resolved on its own. The call to adventure, the call to action, needs to be something that is only going to continue to degrade and get worse if direct action is not taken to stop it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I know I really enjoyed getting to play with just when I start building a book, is getting to figure out what are the dire consequences of this plot if it is left completely to itself, and how will this terribly affect my character's life or the lives of the people that they care about the most, so that you can accurately figure out what the personal stakes are in it for your hero when they do finally decide, screw it, I guess I have to deal with this.
And I mean, there are stories though that do have something that completely resolves itself, and a big example a lot of people use.
Those are great.
Yeah, but like Indiana Jones, there's the one Indiana Jones film that with the Nazis in World War II and the Ark, I think it's the Ark of the Covenant, and if you were to take Indiana Jones out of that entire movie, it would still end the exact same way that it ended.
Yeah.
So there's really not that big of a difference of what he did along the way. So it's a lot of adventure and a lot of really cool stuff. But if you really step back and look at it, you could have pulled the protagonist out and still had the same result in the end, with the Ark of the Covenant being opened and everyone having their faces melted off.
Honestly, same with the Holy Grail. At the end of the day, the Nazis get it. They're going to drink from the wrong cup. They're going to die. Like, it's just the way that it goes.
And they would have sent more people in until they drank them. Well, I guess not. No, because it didn't start earthquaking until they moved the cup over a thing. So they would have gotten it, but
they probably would have died though.
Yeah.
And then it would have been lost down the crevice, and nobody would have ever been able to get it again. Maybe.
I'm sitting here thinking to myself, I'm not sure if I agree with either of those statements, but I'm gonna let it go, because like I said, I don't want to take us off down the road of why Indiana Jones I don't know. Never mind.
But there's a
I
lot
mean,
of
he
adventure.
could. You do need him for some of the like the puzzle piece type things. It's
Yeah,
the
right.
he is there as an important character, but it is kind of just those moments where it's fun to be able to play around with that idea,
Yeah.
even of just the wait, my hero could have just left well enough alone and everything would have been fine. They didn't need to have this big adventure. And I feel like in some ways that's almost a plot that's really well suited for kids' books in some ways.
Yeah. And it is a good exercise to take a look at your story and ask that question. If I pull my character out, is this story going to end the same way? Or does any part of this story actually hinge on the actions of my character and what they're doing directly? So that is a good way of kind of looking at things. But with all of this happening with the refusal of the call, oftentimes it's because the hero is feeling insecure. They feel like they don't know what they should be doing, or they don't have the strength of the power. And that's where we really meet the mentor. So the mentor may have come in the call to adventure to give the call and then disappeared like a certain wizard. Or this is where they come in for meeting the mentor, and you actually see some work being done with the mentor where, you know, Batman has Alfred and all the weapon tech that he has. Even Iron Man has Jarvis. There's a lot of the mentor doesn't need to be a physical living being. There could be a lot of different things, but it's the mentor is going to be the thing that gives the hero the tools they need, the training, and the sense of self to believe that they can actually take that next step across.
Absolutely.
I mean, you can combine it too, right? I mean, you can also have like, you know, one person. I have a character that I'm working in two characters in my book. One is more the adventure. One is more reluctant. She is willing to jump on the adventure. He is willing to stay at home but get dragged on the adventure, you know, without, you know, reluctantly, right? So, I mean, you can also combine it. I guess there's a situation as kind of a mentor, but I don't know. But again, like you said, you can kind of switch it up, you know, or, you know, have that person that's ready to go, and then also have that person that's, I don't really want to go, but you're dragging me by my ear, and we're off the road climbing a mountain, right? So,
And it depends on the problem too, because if it's a multifaceted problem, it might very well be that you need to have a couple of protagonists or your main protagonist and a posse for them that is able to also help with some of the protagonist's failings. And your mentor can also be more than one person. I know for my book, there's one fairly stereotypical mentor type character. You know, he's older, you know, he knows the hero, the main character, for a very long time. And then there is a younger man who is almost like a mentee of the main character, but still has those little nuggets of wisdom at times that really helps that main character put things into a different perspective. And you need those different areas covered in your story.
Exactly, and there's no problem with having more than one mentor. Going back to the concept of that I started at the beginning with Captain America, he was a scrawny kid who was really willing to get out there and fight the good fight at the war, and he was too small. He kept being refused. So when you've got a willing hero, there's generally obstacles blocking them. Rather than an unwilling hero who's throwing up their own obstacles, a willing hero has to overcome their own obstacles. And that's where the German doctor came in and said, you want to join the military? Be a part of my experiment, and literally gave Stephen Rogers the abilities and the tools to fight and do what he needed to do. But the doctor wasn't the only mentor. There was also Howard Stark, and there was also Peggy that kind of acted in a mentor program for him as well along the way. And again, staying in the concept of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, in Iron Man, or the Age of Ultron movie, where we really spend a lot of time with Jarvis. Getting to know Jarvis, having quips back and forth, conversations, and then Jarvis is Iron Man's mentor, and then later in that film, Jarvis is killed by Ultron. So we still have, even though it's not a physical living or human mentor at this point, there is the death of the mentor even in that film as well.
Oh. Saddest death for an AI, like
Both of them.
Yeah.
Like, seriously.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Jarvis
yes.
has been. I mean, some of the Avengers have been through a lot, but that's
Yeah.
But speaking of which, we're crossing the threshold. We're coming up on crossing the threshold. Time is really flying through for us. This is a great conversation that we're having.
Yep.
But talking about this and crossing the threshold, I think it's a good time to pause for our book of the month, which LJ has for us.
And I am really excited about this book of the month. It is one that I have already read, and apparently my fellow scribes have not read, but they've seen the movie. And we all know how well movies translate books. So I am very excited that our book of the month is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, which if you have only seen the movie, you are doing yourself a great disservice because the book is so much better and is an interesting, different story because the Hollywood treatment went on hardcore on this book. And I am very excited to get the reactions from my fellow scribes when they get to the end of this book.
In my defense, Will Smith.
Yeah.
Great actor.
I mean, it is a decent it's a decent movie. It's an okay book movie. And I mean, it both gains and loses points for the dog.
Yes, that's true. From what I understand. And so Ted, that is the book of the month because our next month's topic is going to be
He didn't know there was going to be a quiz.
Oh, I didn't tell you about the quiz? Come on.
No, is that supposed to be in a quiz? Oh my
I thought
God.
I told you about the quiz. No, our next month's topic is, this is where the power of audio editing comes into play.
Yes, they will. They will. Seriously.
Our next month's topic is tropes. How tropey
Tropes.
is too tropey. The good, the bad, and the ugly about tropes. And so that's what we're looking at the book I Am Legend because it does have some tropes within, and it also flips a trope on its head, which is a very good thing.
And if anybody is interested in, I like I said, like you said, I had never read it. So, but if anybody is wanting to read it along with us for next week, I did find that on Audible, if you have a subscription, it is free on there right now. You can look up I Am Legend and other stories, and you can listen to it along. We don't have to buy anything, and that's most likely how I'm going to do it because I'm a slow-ass reader. So, it's
an excellent way to do that.
Yes.
Audiobooks are still reading.
Yes, I had that conversation tonight. Audiobooks are definitely still reading. And I think what Ted means by next week is next podcast, which will be in a month's time. So you've got more time than... so for next month, you can read along. If you don't want to read along, if you're busy or if you're have your hands occupied with other things, like with a child, then you can download the Audible book and listen to it there. And as Ted was saying, it is a free download.
Yeah, it's there.
But be aware,
we're excited
because we will know if you have watched the movie instead of read the book.
There will be a quiz.
Very obvious.
Oh God, all these quizzes.
There will be a quiz.
Oh, I don't. Quizzes, no.
So we're about to cross the threshold into the special world. So when you start the hero's journey, you're starting in the ordinary world. You cross the threshold into the special world, and then eventually you loop back a changed, bigger, better person back into the ordinary world. So speaking of things changing and becoming bigger and better or just different, and talking about Book of the Month, let's pause for a moment just to discuss Joseph Campbell and the Hero with a Thousand Faces. How does that book stand up to today, considering it was written in, I think, 1949?
It is very. He loves Freud. He loves the top psychologists of the day. He mentions them constantly. Yeah, he's always comparing things to their theories. The writing is...
Yeah. So he writes eloquently.
Yes, very fluent.
And he has a number of interesting points. But especially as a woman reading a lot of this, or as a woman reading it, but a lot of this is very sexist, and there's a lot of pretty racist things.
Yes.
And honestly, it does a disservice to men too. It's a book that, and it's one of the few books that I'm going to say this, that you should read the TV tropes about the hero's journey if you're wanting to learn about it as a writer. If you want an insight into the history of the monomyth and the history of modern psychology, then this is well worth reading and being frustrated by. But if you're looking at it as a writer, I'd go for, we read it, so you don't have to. I'm still standing by that.
And that brings up a really good point in the sense that we, like I said off the top, we recommended reading this book to give you an understanding of where the hero's journey came from, what its what its origins were. And there are some things that were cut from it. But it's also something to remember that there's reasons why people push back on Freudian theories of psychology and on I'm just completely blanked on the other name.
Jung was another one that
so
he used.
On Freud and
on Jung.
On Jungian styles of psychology and Freudian styles of psychology, there's a lot of modern day pushback on those things. And this book, as LJ pointed out in a meeting earlier, was originally written for psychologists. And it was to explain psychology, like this concept was written for psychologists. So it's more of an academic book, but it does give the launching point of the hero's journey that we're talking about tonight.
And I don't want to kind of poo-poo it too much because it has an excellent place in our history, especially knowing some of the stories that came from it and have been inspired by both Joseph Campbell's work but also some of those psychologists. So even if Jung and Freud and whatnot have been fairly debunked, it doesn't change that some of those concepts are still a lot of fun to play with. And I definitely recommend watching Babylon 5 if you're interested in Jungian psychology, because he pulled so much from there and tells this incredible story through that TV show that without having the hero's journey, the monomyth, and the Jungian psychology, it just wouldn't be the same. So it's still good resource material, but you just need to kind of know what you're getting into when you pick it up.
But I mean, also, if it didn't exist, then like the hero's journey as the format we were talking about tonight wouldn't have existed because, Vogler is credited. I mean, I looked this up because the other day I was thinking to myself, I need to make sure I know the history behind this. So I mean, Christopher Vogler, who was actually a screenplay writer, originally wrote a kind of a few page pamphlet for a studio that kind of outlines a revised version of the monomyth that's described in Joseph Campbell's book, and then eventually, since when it took off and he realized that this is what actually can kind of work with inside cinema, right, that he actually ended up writing the writer's journey, right, which is his book that fully outlines the whole entire hero's journey from the 12 steps, from the 17, I guess, that were in the Joseph Campbell's work. But in actually, it's kind of funny because I didn't realize that this writer's journey is specifically for screenplay writers. But a lot of this, as we've kind of outlined, has fit through many, many, many different genres and through many stories that were there, right? And if you mentioned Star Wars before, and so it's like this whole modern concept of the hero's journey didn't exist when Lucas first did. He was banking off of Joseph Campbell's piece, right? That's what he was using, right?
Exactly.
Some of the Tolkien's same thing, right? But most modern stories that we have after this was kind of filtered out and kind of brought into the 12 steps that are right now, a lot of people know. Those things kind of follow that after this was brought into more of a centralized light. So, I don't know.
That's true. And to be clear as well, we're not saying that the book doesn't have merit or doesn't have value. It's written
Yes.
in questionable terms. However, this is the book. So what, for those of you who haven't read it, The Heroes with a Thousand Faces is Joseph Campbell did many years of research going through different myths and fables and fairy tales and stories from different cultures all around the globe. And then broke them all down and realized they all kind of followed the same 17-step sequence or a variation thereof. And that's what the hero's journey is, where in a story that have maximum impact, it kind of follows along these steps. What we mean by racist language, and then psychology is enough of it, but is explanatory enough, but it's just the terminology that's used and the way things are referenced is no longer appropriate.
It feels very colonial in its language.
Exactly. But it's the value of the book lies more in the understanding of how tales are told throughout the globe and around the world, and how there's these connections that interconnect all of these different cultures along, which in a sense shows that we're actually more related than we are separate from each other.
It does. And I think one of the things that, if you've already written your book, you should go back with the hero's journey and look through, because more than likely you're already going to discover that you have these beats, whether or not you even intended to, because it seems to be a story that we know well, just because of the media that we have already consumed, that we always have just kind of at the back of our minds. And it just seems to be part of kind of our nature as storytellers to follow a lot of these similar beats.
So the next beat that we're coming up to is, I think we can actually put beat 5 and 6 together, if my scribes agree. And
yes, indeed.
So beat 5 is the heroes gained all the knowledge. It's the crossing the threshold. They've gained all the knowledge, all of the tools that they need to be able to begin off in their journey. And they've worked with the mentor, and sometimes the work with the mentor is cut short. Again, using Captain America as an example, there's a bombing, and the mentor is killed in that point, and he has to run off and unwieldily use his new powers to try to capture the bad guy. And that's where we start to see him trying to figure out what's going on with himself. And then we move into the next step, which is the test allies and enemies. So crossing the threshold is something major happens that they have no choice. The building you're in blows up and something important is stolen. It's up to you to go chase down the bad guy and rectify this. And that goes into the test allies and enemies. And that's where the protagonist is going to have their new skills put to the test. They're going to meet new allies, and we're going to get introduced truly to the enemies for the first time.
Which is my favorite part, because I love the villains. So when you finally get those villains introduced, I start becoming so much more interested in your story.
So a tip, introduce villains early, even as a hint.
Yes, that's a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You can absolutely introduce your villain and not have the protagonist know it until it becomes much more obvious within these tests.
Exactly. Now, in the test allies and enemies, this is the point where it can be a longer part of the story. And this is, so the first 5, up to the first 5 beats is about 25% of your story. Beats 5 to 10 are about 50% of your story, and then the rest is the final 25%. So the beats 6, 7, 8, and 9 are the ones that are kind of in the special world, and that's where that's the kind of the meat and potatoes, the middle section of the story where you have more stuff happening. So in test allies and enemies, this is where your protagonist doesn't feel fully comfortable in their abilities, and they're fumbling and not quite doing well. They might get themselves in trouble. They may need to be helped by a group, some allies that come along the way, or they may rescue some people that become their allies that help them along the way. And generally, this is where things start to go bad for your hero, because oftentimes not all the allies survive.
Poor Bucky. Seriously.
Yeah.
Poor Bucky.
Yeah.
I mean,
poor Bucky.
We're doing a Captain America thing. They rescue all these guys that were in that camp, and they all become his friends, and then Bucky falls off a train. Ah, God.
Yeah.
It's so sad.
Yeah.
But that becomes part of the ordeal, right? And that's something that is a further spurring on of that.
Yeah. Which then leads you to the approach the inmost cave, which is just the things are continuing to go poorly. It just is the continuing of a things are going to go very, very badly for your hero. This is where you're getting somewhat close to like the climax of your book, I believe, at this point. But it's where you're not able to, as the reader, be confident that your hero is either going to come out of it alive, come out of it with all their limbs, come out of it with all of their allies, or actually win at all. This is getting to the darkest time in your story.
It's like Bilbo
exciting.
Going into the cave where Smaug is sleeping, right? And sitting there, seeing this dragon, because you're going into the challenge, right? I think that's what it is. You're raiding the headquarters of your enemies. You're getting to that point,
leading into the ordeal.
Yeah,
exactly. And this is a spot too where you have the heroes, not, because it is tests, so they're not always winning. Like I said, they're suffering, they need allies to come through, they lose allies along the way. So leading up to the approach of the innermost cave, there's a spot too where they need to kind of pause and regroup, come up with a plan, come up with a reason that they've been through a lot, and the reader has been through a lot. So this is a good spot between the test allies and enemies and approach the innermost cave. They give everybody involved a bit of a breath. They regroup, they kind of lick their wounds after they've lost some of their allies. They're going through their suffering, they're trying to deal with and cope with and understand what's happening, and they have to reformulate a plan as they're continuing along for the approach and going into things and gaining the tools they need to get into the ordeal.
And pacing wise, it is, as Travis said, a very good moment to give your readers that you could have that sense of impending doom coming, but to give your readers that little bit of a break, because you can't go from just go all the time, because your reader gets fatigued. But if you give those pauses, especially before something massive happens, your reader will have the emotional bandwidth to actually truly feel what you just threw at them or what you're about to throw at them. If you remember that sometimes the best part of a story is just that moment around the campfire where your characters talk a little bit and you get to know a little bit more about one character's background. Usually, it's kind of the spot where somebody, says that, yeah, I've got a wife back home and she's got a baby and I'm really excited, et cetera, et cetera. And it's that setup emotionally where you are laying the hints that dude's not coming home.
That's it. And that, to go back to the Captain America sequence, this doesn't need to be a very long pause. It's just a moment, literally a moment to catch your breath. So in Captain America, Bucky is dead. They come back and he's a hero. And all the guys that he's saved from the POW camp are drinking and having their moment of levity. They're getting drunk. They're having their time. Whereas Captain Rogers has gone off. He's by himself in some broken down, blown out bar. And he's drinking and drinking and drinking. And this is where you can bring in a mentor, someone to give a bit of a boost, someone to give you a bit of a kick, the you've had it in you all along moment. And also a spot for further exposition, like LJ was just saying, on how to explain a little bit more. So we see Captain America drinking. Peggy Carter comes in and kind of gives him the kick that he needs. But there's also that little, seems like an innocuous moment, but he says, I can't get drunk. And that further explains his powers. Well, because of this, you heal faster. Because you heal faster, that means your body metabolizes alcohol faster, so you're not going to be able to get drunk no matter how much you drink. So it's a scene that has exposition that doesn't have heavy exposition in it. And it's just a brief moment before we jump back in.
Yeah, I don't want that power. It seems very sad. So, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, as someone who is drinking a glass of wine right now, yes, it's tasty, but would I drink this if it didn't have the little bit of the buzz to it too? Probably not.
Yeah, you might as well just drink
soda.
Non-alcoholic beer, which is always tastes horrible.
Oh, actually, I gotta say, Europe has some good ones. There's a couple of good European non-alcoholic beers that I can tolerate. Because there's sometimes I feel like having a beer and I don't feel like alcohol. But anyways, that is completely sidetracked. So now they face the ordeal, and the ordeal is the biggest conflict. This is the moment that everything has been leading up to, and this is the moment where the protagonist faces the antagonist. They have their massive face-off, or first massive face-off against each other, and the outcome of this ordeal permanently changes the perspective of the protagonist for the rest of the story.
And in many books, this is the lead up to good things have happened. So this can be they have, defeated or are going to defeat. But it can also be, this is a moment that you can really have a lot of fun with deciding what kind of story you want to tell, whether it's going to be, a tragedy or not. And one other thing to do is play around with the idea of less is more, and kind of consider where your focus is going to be when you're writing it. Because there are times where if you draw back and you show too much, you lose an emotional impact. Whereas if you zoom in a great deal, you get the emotional impact. So considering moments like Schindler's List, where you see that girl with the red jacket. And even though this isn't at the right, it's not at the ordeal or anything like that, but just that is a zoom in focus on just one character that terrible things are going to happen to. That you can use something like that for the ordeal, for zooming in on one little thing to help really get that emotional punch, so that then you can go in and make it feel even better when your hero actually defeats your villain.
And that's also foreshadowing too. In that case,
yeah.
you know that he's calling that image out for a reason.
Yeah.
And in that movie's case, it's obviously not going to be a good thing, right? But
yeah.
But
yeah, that's a very powerful moment
in
cinematography history. Most definitely.
Yes.
But once they've faced the ordeal, and they've generally they have to go. So when they're facing the ordeal, when they're approaching the innermost cave and going through that stuff and going through the test allies and enemies, that's when they really can kind of begin to sink back into their old ways of, I really don't know if I have the strength to continue on with this. They're motivated and they're still pushing forward. And when they get to the ordeal, in order to survive the ordeal, to go through it, they need to really start stepping through their transformation process. And kind of this is where they can begin to face this is where they kind of come across their darkest moment, their darkest hour, and that's going to be the thing that alters them and changes their perspective moving forward in the story. And this scene does need to be an exciting scene. This is basically the midpoint of your story, and you've made a promise to the reader that they're going to, in the ordinary world, that come with me and you're going to be along for this amazing epic ride. And this is one of those points where we really need to kind of stand and deliver on the promise that you made, and have a good solid payoff for the reader to keep them hooked in for the rest of the story moving forward, and to continue caring about the character. And as we said, each step along the way, you need to be thinking about how each of these beats impact your character's growth. Where do they grow? Where do they recoil as you go through each step along the way?
Absolutely. Because after you have hit the ordeal, when they're going through the recovery and you've potentially defeated the villain, those kinds of things, it's coming out of that darkest hour, you still have to give the reader a reason to care about the denouement of your book, about the end of your book, and not just be like, oh, okay, cool, I'm done now. I'm going to just go off and read the next book that does this better. You want to hold them in and have them really care about your characters. So you want them wrestling with inner demons. You want them having an excellent moment here, even if they're in emotional toil, physical agony, etc. You want to have a great moment of them coming out on the other side of it.
But there are some good examples.
That's what I figure.
Well, but there's also some good examples where they get to that point and then they get everything taken away from them yet again, right? And it's how authors have mixed things up, and I'm trying to think of an example of where that goes. I know it has happened, but I can't think of anything that follows that path. But I know there are some examples that.
Usually those kinds of stories where like the ordeal is just devastating completely and everything is taken away. Those seem to usually be at the midpoint of a trilogy, because it's those moments of, okay, like Empire Strikes Back. think that's the name of the movie. We're gonna have Star Wars fans now.
Oh my
just
God!
totally
Are you
dump it.
serious? Oh, yes.
Yes,
Middle
Empire.
movie.
But that's the thing is Empire is an excellent example of you lose a lot. Like that is a movie where everything is lost. You get the high point of, Han is in carbonite. Luke loses his hand. He comes to an awful revelation. Like all of these terrible things happen. But you're invested for the rest of the movie still. You're invested for the rest of the story. And then you get everything improving for the next movie.
Now, I have to say one thing, though. I realize I misspoke a little bit earlier in the sense that the test allies and enemies approaching the innermost cave in the ordeal. The ordeal is Bucky dying in that scene. And then the reward seizing the sword. So it's after the ordeal that they have that pause. But you still need to have that moment of pause where they're coming from the test allies and enemies. When he goes off, he is tested, he breaks into the POW camp, he saves all the men, they come back, and there is that moment of levity, a pause with all the guys drinking, and then he steps in and says, okay, now we really need to take the battle forward. Here's how we're going to do it. So you have that brief pause, but the pause that I mentioned actually came after the ordeal, the second pause that you want to give the reader when you're in the story. So I just want to clarify, I skipped a part of the story back in the past. It's okay. And it's important because this is where you do, like I said, you're giving a little bit more exposition of the character and explaining a little bit more and bringing things down to their lowest. So in the Captain America form, Bucky's dead. He doesn't believe he can go on any further. He doesn't think, what's the point? Why? How can I do this? How can I continue? And that's where he gets the meeting with a mentor, a mentor, or it could be an ally, it could be a friend. That gives him a bit of a kick. That pushes him forward into the next step.
Yeah. I think that it's a good point, though, to sort of look at this and these are not necessarily steps that you have to adhere perfectly to write a good story.
It's not prescriptive, right? I mean,
exactly.
No one's going to come over and slap your hand if you've mixed them up for any reason or just because you're trying to be creative. I mean, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, right? But exactly. I mean, that's why you have to step back and look at it and say, does this fit here? Did I do this in a different way and it doesn't work? I have to change it up. And that's why these outlines are so special, right? And there's so many other ones other than just the hero's journey, but comparing your work to one of them to see whether or not it actually fits. And where you've changed it and if it's gone wrong. I mean, it's a good exercise, right? And we've said that earlier in the podcast as well. So
that's it. And it's also, it's not a plug and play. Because people, when you say template, people fear that, it's going to be formulaic, it's going to come out, it's going to be the same as everything else. And yes, it can be. If you don't have good characters, if you don't do proper world building, if you don't kind of take it and make it your own. So when we say that the ordeal is at the 50% mark, it doesn't mean that at page 50 of 100, you have to have your ordeal. It means within that range, in 100 pages, it should be, or in 1,000 pages, it should be around 400 to 600 pages you should have in that somewhere, the center point of your story, the ordeal that's going to be happening. Because some stories may need more build up to the ordeal, so it may come in at the 55% mark. Some need the ordeal to happen at the 42% mark so they can have kind of a continuation of the climax and a beginning drop down of things from this moment.
Exactly.
And then we do get into the reward and seizing the sword. They've survived. They've gone forward conceivably, and they've gained their reward.
Yep. It's usually the part where my favorite characters are now dead or dying or licking their wounds. And you get the hero having a little bit of a moment. Whether or not it's a good moment, whether or not they can necessarily enjoy the moment, this can be a little bit where that breathing happens that was mentioned. Sometimes that reward, it doesn't feel worth the cost to your hero. And sometimes that reward does make everything absolutely worth it. And so it depends on the kind of story you're telling, what your reaction, what the character's reactions are going to be to these moments.
That's
I mean,
exactly. Oh, sorry. Go
if
ahead.
you no, it's fine. But if you look at some of the, I'm going to use The Hobbit as an example because I don't know, maybe it's my favorite thing right now, at least tonight. But like, if you look at how they follow him, and then he gets that ring, right? He finds it there, right? And then he ends up, I think he finds it in the cave. I can't remember. It's a very long time. But I mean, then he gets knocked out, right? And so he doesn't even see the seizing of and the defeat of Smog, right? He's not even a part of that, right? And you get the
He
sense
is, because there's the he has still that conversation with Smaug.
he does,
But yeah.
but the rest, that conversation is if you're thinking we've approached the inner cave, we're there, we're doing the ordeal, we're have our confrontation with Smog, right? He does what he needs to do, gets out, and then gets knocked out, and then
That's right.
and then the road back for him is like, well, what happened? Everybody else, you won the battle, great. Well, tell me about it, right? So
Yeah.
I think that's how, like, when we were talking about, like, this is not so formatic. It's not a formula for you always to follow, right? You can follow it to a T if you want, but taking those risks and mixing things up like that, and Bilbo's example, right? He doesn't see the rest of the seizing of the dwarven kingdom again, right? He goes to sleep. He goes, and then, well, not to
Which
sleep.
works so well since he's a hobbit. I mean, it's fitting to just be like, I'm out. I'm done. He's not a warrior. He's not any of these things. Like, it's not needed for Bilbo to be there. Yeah, he's the thief. He doesn't have to be the great warrior. And that's okay. Like, that happens. Yes, that happens also in the Chronicles of Prydain, in the first one, which I think is the Book of 3. Forgive me, it's been a little while since I read them, but I know that the main character, he gets the sword, and it's a magic sword, and he's in the battle, but when he picks it up, it is too powerful for him. It's too strong, it's too much, and he almost dies, and he does end up knocked out. And so he doesn't actually take on and kill the big bad. It is an adult. It is the prince. He comes through and he does it, and he saves the hero. But you don't necessarily get to see that. But it fits the theme of the book, and fits the theme of the books and the whole series of the Taran has to grow up. And that sometimes what he does is absolutely necessary, and sometimes he is the kid getting in the way of the grown-ups. And I love that, just as a tangent for kids' books, because so often you get the child somehow knows much more than every single adult in existence. But, tangent for another day.
That is true. And that's the thing, is that the reward sometimes is given, it's granted, it's found, it's stolen, it's claimed after you've done that. And that's not, so the ordeal isn't the climax. The ordeal is a climax of the story. And that's where the hero's journey kind of goes up on a rising action, has this little moment as a bit of a falling action, then it goes back up into the rising action where we hit the actual climax, which we're coming up to. But this is where there is something, there's knowledge, there's information, there's an object, there's a magic talisman, there's something that is gained by the hero. But of course, we're not even a full 75% away through the story yet. There's still so much more to go. So of course, we have to make things much worse for the protagonist, for our hero, as we go along, because that's just what we like to do as writers. We like to torture people.
Always.
Exactly.
Yeah, always.
Is that the same for children's books, Teds?
Well, I guess it really depends. I mean, kids do seem to know a lot more than the adults in kids' books, especially this one series I'm reading now that my son, Dragon Masters, we talked about how, well, we didn't, but we've talked in the past on how generally in this thing it's like a farm boy, and he's an onion farmer.
Always the farm boy.
But he suddenly knows more about dragons than the giant wizard who has all these books. It's kind of annoying. A little bit there, but my son enjoys it, so that's all that matters. So, but yeah, they don't. A lot of times they don't go have that second rising in kids books, specifically like mid-grade novels. They don't have a lot of that second writing. It's pretty much straight up and then straight down once you get to the point, right?
Yeah.
So
The
it's a little more complex. Yeah, it's a little more complex when it comes to.
But because they're
novels.
suffering. Oh, actually, Elja, you're going to make a comment on the.
Oh, it's gone now.
But yeah, so they've taken the reward, and we're going to make them suffer because that's what writers do. And now they're off on their road home, and they are being chased. This is in the moment, if you're in like a James Bond film or an action film or something like that, this is the chase scene. This is where everything is blowing up around. This is where they're being hunted down by, they may have defeated the villain, but the villains, or pushed them aside for a little while, and this is where the cohorts or the little minions of the villain are now chasing down the hero to try to reclaim what they had. Or things just go belly up in other ways as they go along.
I mean, you could always do it the opposite way too. I've seen books where, once they get the reward's instantly taken away from them, and then now they have to go figure out how to get it back, right? I mean, look, that's exactly what happened. We used the example in Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones discovers the Ark, then they rush right in and grab it, and they tie him up, and now they got to figure out a way to get out of it, right? So that's the second ordeal, I guess. I don't know.
No, that's like the perfect example for that, because it would have been what I was going to actually say, is that, it is the perfect moment of you think everything is going to be okay. He's got it. Everything is like, oh, never mind. The Nazis are here.
There's that shady one that steps in and just takes it away from you. And you're like, I just got this thing. What the hell?
And that's exactly it. The reward can be lost along the way as well. But and it doesn't have to be an object. It can be knowledge. It can be learning that this is the person that actually killed, your best friend. Or it could be that they realize that the person they've been chasing all the way along has been a shadowy figure. That's not actually the villain. That's someone that's been acting in the villain's stead, or that the villain is actually, they've gone and they've reached the villain's lair and they've gone through all these ordeals to realize the villain is somewhere else. And so this is where they go through their paces, they go to their darkest moment, they finally have the reward, and it can be a piece of knowledge, a piece of our princess is another castle.
Yeah.
Yes. Mario.
Exactly.
Poor Mario. She's always in another castle, right? So, God.
So as a gamer, just completely small little tangent, I could not help it, but I have a moment where some of the heroes in my book are looking for some knowledge, and I do legitimately have a librarian basically tell them no, sorry, that book's in another library. And I was like, I cannot resist using this line because I am this much of a nerd. Has to be here.
I thought you were going to say you sent them down a pipe to find the book.
That could still happen for the next book. Maybe I will have to send someone down a pipe.
That could work in Ted's next book.
Yeah.
Well, they're mice, so I mean they can go down pipes really easily. So, and they're already in a sewer in this one, so I guess they're kind of in pipes.
There you go.
Right?
So
there you go.
So what you're saying is I'm the only one dropping the ball on the Mario references here.
No.
Yeah.
No. Well, you're in the process of writing your book. You could still add Mario references in. You have time.
I love how you consider starting chapter 3 of 23 in the process. Not you're just beginning.
In the process.
You're writing it. That's the process. It's still in. You're still moving along.
There's 20 chapters worth of possibilities still going on here.
I know. Just Easter eggs all over the place. I mean, come on.
Exactly.
Seriously.
To be fair, though, if you do go to my website, I do have a short story that heavily involves Super Mario Brothers.
Oh.
So
definitely going to be doing that after the recording. But yeah.
I think it's called A Bad Day. If I'm not mistaken, that was the one. Anyways, so they do go through the reward. They seize the reward, and it's either stolen from them, they lose it, they've angered a lot of people in taking the reward, or they've learned that the focus that they had is a smaller part of a much bigger picture, and they go through they're going through their road back, which is going to take them back out of the special world into the ordinary world.
Yeah, leaving all of the fun and magic behind, which is not actually a literal, they have to leave the special world. There is no obsidian or Oblivion Gate required or anything like that to take them into a regular place. It is a metaphorically speaking ordinary world.
Yes, this is another stepping across the threshold, and this is the point where your hero has transformed. So the ordeal, their darkest moment, has given them, and the kick in the pants by the mentor, has given them the concept of any hesitation I had before, any thought of going back to who I was before is completely gone. I'm my new person. I feel strong about my abilities. I know what I can do. And this threat that's here is so big, it has to be stopped at any cost. I'm going to make this stop.
This is the moment from The Lord of the Rings, the books, where, you know, Pippin and Merry and Frodo and Sam all get back to the Shire and do the, seriously? Saruman's here? No. We are kicking him out. This is ridiculous. We are over this crap. We just defeated Sauron. What do you mean we now have to do this? And yeah, this is the point that they're at the resurrection.
Exactly. So this is where they're stepping back into the ordinary world with their transformation. Not fully complete,
yes,
but they've got their transformation kind of pretty well at hand. And they are now running headlong into their biggest obstacle, into the climax of the story and the final confrontation. Because this is just as there was crossing the threshold in Beat 5, where there was an explosion, there was something that forced them out of their ordinary world and into the life of adventure. This is now what they think they've got a little bit of an opportunity to breathe. They're coming back in, and there's something even bigger and more dire, which oftentimes kind of mirrors the beginning, crossing the threshold. Or at least, and this is a good opportunity to use this spot to restate the central conflict of your story. And the central internal, external conflict that the hero had along the way, and how they've overcome it to this point.
Absolutely. And then you get Return with the Elixir, which is, I think everyone calls it something different, depending on what you look at.
Well, there's also the Resurrection.
Which, yes, there's the Resurrection, then there's the Return with the Elixir. And that is you're getting to the conclusion of your story at this point. So you have your denouement. This is the actual point of denouement. I think in a lot of modern writing, we really scrunch together a lot of these last steps, which, good thing, bad thing. There's reasons for both.
Yep.
And it also depends on whether or not you're writing a standalone novel or a series, how much time you end up devoting to the last couple of steps, and whether or not you're leading into a continuation of the cycle, which is the coming back to the ordinary world, or the step one again.
Yeah, and moving, but it's a new ordinary world that's being presented.
Yes,
and that's the thing, because the resurrection is the climax of the story, the ultimate point that you've been dragging the reader, or walking hand in hand, the reader, all the way up to this point. And this is the biggest, most dangerous encounter, the definitive encounter for the hero. And LJ's completely right. The general rule of thumb, after all of this stuff, is the biggest battle, the final climactic thing, happens around the 85 to 90% mark of the story.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of buildup for a short section of action, which needs to be really either brought in a little bit earlier or really, really punchy and have a massive payoff for the reader. Because this is where you are truly keeping your promise. Because you brought them to the ordeal, which was one step of keeping the promise, but then you tapped them on the shoulder and said, hey, come with me still. I've got something even bigger and better to show you. And this is where you pay off.
Exactly. I know with my book, I ended up at that, halfway point. There are, some of the characters that are coming to realize that they are just not quite equipped well enough to handle some of these issues that are going forward. But then you get towards probably, the last 15% of the book. And it's okay, we've been talking about a war for the entirety of this. We've been talking about these people trying desperately to avoid a war. And here it goes. You've been at that, breath before the plunge for several chapters now, and now it's time to dive in. And it is you have to make sure. I rewrote those chapters so many times because that is the area where if you don't deliver, people get frustrated, they get upset, they toss your book aside. It's come on, I sat through hours and hours and hours of my life to get to this. You really want them to feel it.
Yeah. And you want them to pick up your next book, especially
yes.
if it's part of a series, or even if it's, even more importantly, not part of a series.
Yeah.
You want them to be left with the sensation of, wow, I really like that. I really want to pick up the next book by this author. What do they have out? And start researching and like Googling what they can and finding what they can to get their hands on the next book. But more than that, you want this to be the scene where they take the book and they kind of set it down for a moment and they just sit and think and call up 10 of their friends saying, you got to read this book. I can't believe what I just read.
You want the wow factor.
Exactly. And then they pick it up or like have that moment. I don't think it's a bad thing to have a moment for a reader where they're like, I kind of need to recover from this scene before I see how this all finishes off. I know there's only, 100 pages left, but I need to pause for a second here because that just
yes.
really took me for a ride.
I want to make people cry when they read. I want to have something happen that they have to take a break and absolutely do I can't believe they just did that. I cannot believe you just did that to this person. Or I am so happy that they finally got the payoff. You definitely want to have, or at least I know I want to have those moments of very deep, strong emotion for my reader of the love me a little bit and hate me a lot kind of thing.
I don't think I've ever had that moment in any book I've ever read where I've had this, I just like had to sit it down and like, there was one book that I really love. It's by Brent Weeks and I can't remember the title. It's up there. I'm not going to go look for it because it'll take time. But there was a moment that was kind of disturbing that I had to put the book down and sit there and say, I don't know if I really want to continue this. Right. And I think that for me, I don't think I've ever had that moment, and maybe there's something wrong with me, No. Well, there's a lot wrong with me. Let's be honest. That's why I'm the oddball scribe, right? So,
yes, but it doesn't necessarily even have to be as exact to what Travis said. Like it can be whatever that moment is for you. I know for me, if I'm really involved and I'm really interested, if I'm getting to a moment that I think is the same moment that Travis would be putting it down and doing me, wow, I need a moment. I need to share this with people, is my moment of, oh my God, I need to know what happens next. And I am just flipping to the back, like 2 last pages and okay, they survived. We're good. Okay. I now am okay enough. I can continue reading this.
That's it. And
but we all have those different reactions, of the, but you want that. You want in your resurrection and in that last 85% or last 15% of your book to have those moments of excitement and emotional change in your reader.
Yeah. And I was being a bit facetious when, I mean, there are some books where I have done that, where I have set it down and been like, wow, I don't really, because there's also, I've had situations where I've been really let down after that. So I've had those moments where I am so enraptured and caught up and just being wrapped up in this moment right now that it's really going to hurt if they screw up the final end of this. If they, and it is possible, there is still another beat that you have to do. So there is this moment where you can really destroy the entire image that you've had built up with that. But the resurrection is also the point where it's called a resurrection for a reason, because your hero has come back to life from literally being dead for no apparent reason, Jon Snow, or because they are actually they're resurrecting and they're coming through this is where they truly step into the transformation. This is where they truly become the hero. They defeat the villain. They drive the villain off for another day, however the section of the end story ends. But they do so in using everything they learned along the way. All of the hints, all the tips, all the things that they've gone through, all the new abilities are used in this final scene. And this truly shows the transformation and starts closing the arc of the main character The other thing you need to bear in mind is all your other core characters have their own story arcs as well. And
Yes.
all of those, the tailing off of all of the storylines, the closing of the character arcs for the main character and for the core characters or central characters, all begins to occur in, or occurs in, the Return of the Elixir, in the end. And the Return of the Elixir is where the hero has now come back to their world, their ordinary world. They're changed. The threat is, as far as we know, over. And this is where they can start giving out the magical beans, where they can start allowing water to flow back into the village. They can give what they've learned and be the hero to the people and have a moment of celebration.
Exactly. You get to breathe again. Everything is good, et cetera, et cetera. And then you add in your little, epilogue to your next book that leaves that little edge of the, oh, but maybe not everything is solved, which you don't necessarily have to have in a epilogue. You can leave that little hook of the villain's still licking his wounds, but they're licking their wounds and they're not coming back today or tomorrow or the next week. Done.
Exactly. And then all the storylines end up getting wrapped up nice and neatly. And
Exactly.
Again, unless you're doing a teaser. But again, the storyline, the central conflict of this story, the central question has been resolved in this story. That doesn't mean that the villain's not going to come back and cause a whole new central conflict or question to be brought in for this down the road.
Exactly.
Yeah. And there, in a nutshell, is the ordinary world. And sorry, were you gonna say?
That is the hero's journey. All 12 steps of it.
I said the ordinary world because then we come back into the ordinary world. And as we said, it is a circle. So now the hero has changed and grown. And again, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is great at this, where they each go through their individual story arcs. And then, there's a reason why there's an Iron Man 2 and an Iron Man 3, because there's still room to grow. There's still things. So now they're facing the world with their new normal to come into their new transformation. Or sometimes they're coming in because, in the case of, for example, I'm thinking of Iron Man or Thor in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there's points where they're starting a movie and they're not transformed in a positive way from their last film. They've been dragged down and they're in a bad way and they need to come back from it that way. And
well, I mean, it's boring when the character's perfect right off the bat, right? I mean, that's why it wouldn't be a series of books if they didn't have to go through multiple ordeals to become, more enlightened as they go along the way, right? It's, Iron Man's a perfect example of that. He went from a very pretentious asshole to, and I'm realizing that I'm the only one cursing here tonight, by the way. I just realized that, like, I've done it like multiple times already, and I'm like, wait a minute.
I think I may have said a few things as well.
It's all right.
I have stayed perfectly PG as best I can.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah. I try to. I'm gonna have to drink less, or drink more next time.
Actually, I think
drinking more.
What we need to do is, for when we're editing, or for when Ted is editing, to create the
this whole section is coming out, by the way, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. But to use the typewriter thing of when you would used to have to backspace with the typewriter, the click down, the click going backwards. We should just have that instead of the beep button. We should just have the click.
Yes.
I'll put beeps in there whenever, because then it's funny, because it's like when you listen to traditional radio before everybody went to XM and whatever, Sirius, right? Everybody couldn't curse, so they had to make up funny words or ways to say the same thing. That was, anyway. Exactly.
Yep.
We're totally off on a tangent now. But what I was saying was, like, Iron Man isn't perfect. He's a pretentious asshole, right? He's still, and if you look at the comic books, there's so many flaws within that character. It's not like Steve Rogers, who is, he's got that newfound ability. Now he can, utilize it later on, and he's the perfect hero. But Tony Stark was an alcoholic. He was, several different things, in his time, a villain at several stages. But I mean, that's, I think, one of the reasons why they started with him in the first place, because he's such an interesting, very well thought out, and not a perfect character, even after getting back to the ordinary world, but is less of an asshole.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing that Ted brings up, a very important point of getting through the hero's journey doesn't mean that your character no longer has flaws. It just means that there has been a change, hopefully for the better. Exactly. You can leave them as perfectly flawed people, and you should leave them as perfectly flawed people, because perfect people are boring.
Yeah.
They're flat, they're obnoxious. Like, it's not a good character. If
very
you
one-dimensional.
Yeah.
Exactly. If you polish all of the rough edges off, they're no longer interesting. So they get to keep the rough edges. It's just now they have this additional power that they have learned to deal with.
And that is shown really well with Captain America, where you see he starts off as the perfectly polished, and then you see them tease him and make fun of him, and all these different things happen to where he becomes no longer this perfect, 1930s, keep it clean and easy, boys, kind of thing, where he becomes a little bit more rough and jagged around the edges. But where I talk about the story beginning and the end of mirroring, going for a much grander scale, you can also use foreshadow and hint at things. So on a much grander scale, in Age of Ultron, there is a face-off scene between Captain America and this massive spoilers here, everybody. This face-off scene between Captain America and Iron Man, where Captain America says to him, "That's the difference between you and I, is you're not a hero. You don't have what it takes when the chips are down to do what needs to be done to save the day. You're only in this for yourself. You're not a hero." And at the end of the day, it's Tony Stark that sacrifices everything.
Yep.
So if you want to see the hint,
excellent.
Exactly. So if you want to see the character arc carried all the way through, that is a perfect example of this. So you see someone that actually calls him out and basically says, "Hey, man, you're an asshole. You don't have the ability to do the right thing." And then he goes through all this stuff and is dragged through the mud and goes through all these trials and tribulations all the way through to the point where he gets to the end. And he is exactly what he was said not to be at the beginning.
And like, that is just such good writing to have those foreshadowing moments all the way back years in the making, which that's why you keep really good notes when you're writing. You have your little book Bible to keep all of your notes, keep your continuity, and reread your work if you are working on a series, because that is how you have excellent continuity and little things like that that punch hard in the rewatching.
Yeah. And that's where world building really comes into play, and having these things, because if you're writing a short story, you don't need to go that in depth in world building. But if you're doing a series, if you're doing something that, if you want to have fan fiction written about what you're writing about, give them the base to build off of.
Yes. And that is definitely an episode we need to do, is a discussion on fan fiction.
Yes. And imposter syndrome.
Yes. Yes.
That's another one. So that was something. I've had a really rough couple of days. I came out of a pain flare yesterday, and I woke up this morning with the absolute worst case of imposter syndrome ever. It's been a rough day for me today. But that's because my brain's a little bit fuzzy. But at any rate, we have a trailer to fix, and Ted has got his work cut out for him with this broadcast.
Yeah, this is going to be a little over the half-hour mark.
Yeah, it will be. But I mean, this, to be fair, to do what we needed to do and give it proper justice, we needed to go a little bit further.
We did.
So if we want, actually, we can just pause for a second.
Mm-hmm.
In this episode of The Scribe's Journey, we may go a little bit over the 30-minute mark, because this topic is so in-depth and has so many things and points to cover that we may be a little bit longer than our previously promised 30 minutes. There we go. So if you want to cut and paste that somewhere, Ted.
I will figure it out. It's all good.
Yeah, that's the other thing too. I was thinking there's a possibility of doing a two-parter. Let's cut and go to the trailer. Yeah.
Well,
sure.
you gotta say goodnight and all that stuff. So
no, I know that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Okay.
So
yeah.
Anyways, so thank you everyone. This has been a very Carolyn, that's what we're talking about with the outro that we're going to be talking about in a moment. Okay, so enough of stuff for Ted to cut out. thank you everyone for joining us. This has been the three scribes on the Scribe's Journey discussing the hero's journey and how you can enter it in and use it as an outline, or at least use it to compare your story to see if you're following along the steps of the hero's journey. There are plenty of other story writing outlines that we will discuss in future episodes, but for this one, this has been the hero's journey with the Scribe's Journey, and I have been the calm scribe, joined along with
LJ Stanton, the pedantic scribe.
And TR Albee, the oddball scribe.
So thank you for joining us on our journey tonight, and have a fantastic evening. And thank you for joining us for this episode of The Scribe's Journey. We will see you on the next episode.